NATO summit has concluded in United States, but not without its rather interesting moments. From President Joe Biden's very public faux pas to PM Maloney's eye rolls, the summit is dominating social media. But aside from all these funny moments, as the West and its allies celebrated 75 years of the alliance, NATO has called China out for the first time for supporting Russia in its war against Ukraine. Here's a special report on the key highlights of the NATO summit. Take a look. It was a summit that the world had its eyes on, but it's in news for reasons that its leaders might not have wanted. As the North Atlantic Treaty Organization on NATO completed 75 years, American President Joe Biden and Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni made headlines. Even before Biden could address the media upon the conclusion of the summit, he made world leaders gathered in Washington wait for him. And Giorgia Meloni was clearly not amused. Her video of an eye roll and checking an imaginary wristwatch is now viral, with netizens saying they relate to her.
I think she's not qualified to be president, so let's start there.
On the other hand, Biden once again found himself in the middle of multiple gaffes. While interacting with the media, American president called Vice President Kamala Harris as Trump, giving way to online memes on the president.
Picked Vice President Trump to be vice president, but I think she's not qualified to be president. So let's start there.
But aside from these moments, this year's NATO summit would be remembered for one significant statement. For the first time, NATO leaders called China out as a decisive enabler of Russia's war, urging President Xi Jinping to cease political support to Russia. They also said that China is involved in malicious cyber and hybrid activities. The statement marks the first time that European countries have joined the chorus against the dragon. China, meanwhile, has rejected these charges, asking NATO to not create chaos in Asia. However, even as NATO weighed in on the war and reiterated their support for Ukraine, Biden embarrassed himself once again in what could be one of his biggest slip-ups. The US president introduced Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy as President Putin.
Now I want to hand it over to the president of Ukraine, who has as much courage as he has determination. Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin. President Putin. We're going to beat President Putin. President Zelenskyy. I'm so focused on beating Putin, we got to worry about it. Anyway, Mr. President,
I'm better.
You are a hell of a lot better.
Consolidating its support for Ukraine, United States has announced a new security package worth $225 million, which includes a Patriot missile battery, additional ammunition for high-mobility artillery rocket systems and missiles. As the West versus the China-Russia bloc conflict moves towards Cold War-like era, how will India tread its path while being the voice of the global South? All right, so let's decode what happened at the NATO summit on the show tonight. I'm joined by Anil Trigunayat, former ambassador. I'm also joined by Atul Aneja, former associate editor at The Hindu. Good evening and namaskar to both of you gentlemen. Ambassador Trigunayat, let me begin with you. You know, this is the first time that we're seeing the NATO countries lead a charge against China. But the surprising part is that the war has been on for over 2 years now. Why now? Why are they calling out China now?
Not winning, as simple as that. And therefore, NATO and the United States have put in their best foot forward, in fact, in prodding Ukraine to continue this war. And the war is not leading anywhere. And therefore, they have to find certain excuses. And there could as well be collaboration between Russia and China on this. To what extent? But until yesterday, they were trying to woo China. They were sent so many of their leaders going there, talking to President Biden himself has been talking to President Xi Jinping. They tried to follow this competition with cooperation kind of mechanism with China. But today they have realized that it is China is their main challenge. And that's why they're calling out China. And of course, Russia. The two of them are their main challenges. And so it's normal. But even in here, you know that NATO is essentially, in my view, is a tool for Americans to expand their power and maintain it. That's what they're trying to do. So, due to this war, the transatlantic alliance has really become stronger over this time. And that's also could see an outcome of the Russia Ukraine war. So, that we know that. What happens next when Trump comes to power, or we'll have to have a look at that. China is their biggest nemesis, and they understand it. You know, Russia has challenged the United
Okay.
States and the West militarily, whereas China is doing so economically and technologically. And therefore, the combination of the two could as well be a very big challenge for the United States and others. So that's why they're calling it now. So it's the same thing. One side is pumping in arms on
Okay.
one side, the other side may be helping the other.
Okay. Mr. Atul Aneja, it's interesting how China has responded to this entire statement, this declaration by NATO. They've said, don't create chaos in Asia. And I'm no apologist for China. I have no sympathies for China as such. But the fact of the matter is that the West and the European countries keep on urging and pushing other countries to toe their line. They did it with India. China, of course, has been very overtly supportive of Russia. You had President Jinping meet President Putin as well, and there was arms deals and all of that. But why is it necessary for any country to follow the West and its allies' line and vision?
I agree with you over here that, in this case, I see China being made a scapegoat here because of failures of NATO. In the Ukraine war, you can see that despite sending billions of worth of weaponry, Ukraine has made no headway. On the contrary, it's Russia which is making a headway. And you see President Putin going to North Korea, and that is a new alliance which has come into the picture, which has major military consequences, not only for Ukraine, but in fact, it moves into Asia as well. So you're not getting success anywhere. On top of that, the point which Anil made, that your window is pretty narrow at this time, because if Trump comes to power in November, then it's game over in Ukraine. So whatever you have to do it between now. So that's a desperation. And I think in the context of the desperation, you need a scapegoat, and you have found in China that scapegoat. That is because of you that things are going south for them in Russia. So I see that as the context, and I agree with you that that's the Western perspective on the situation. I don't think China, Russia, India, the BRICS look at it that way. I think a new multipolar world is rising, in which these are the countries which are going to, in Eurasia, which are going to count. So, no longer is it a unipolar world, what happened with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, but a world where power has diffused, and no pole within the multipolar world is going to accept the hegemony and the diktat and the narrative of the West. And I see that happening now with the way the Chinese have responded. In fact, the Russians have been responding. As you mentioned, Prime Minister Modi's visit to Russia, despite all that has come in the Western press, we took an independent line. In fact, Zelenskyy went on X to criticize Prime Minister Modi for hugging President Putin. So you see, the West is yet to understand that they no longer call the shots as they used to at one time, and they need to be respectful to other powers which are rising, and India and China and Russia being one of them.
Which is what my next question is, which is what leads me to my next question, Ambassador Trigunayat. How does India really move forward now? Because you've got China on one hand, you already have strained relationship with China. You're trying to balance out your relationship with the West and its allies through this war. How does India move forward, considering the fact that we also are seen as the voice of the global South?
Well, I think, Shreya, we need to look at it in two perspectives. Number one is that India's current positioning. I think India is in a pretty good spot at the moment, as they call it, a sweet spot. That the United States knows that in its China strategy, India can be a very important partner. So that is something. And we do have a global comprehensive strategic partnership with the United States. But they continue to take snide remarks on India whenever we are trying to help them, help the world with peace, dialogue, and diplomacy. So they don't understand that. They have an alliance mindset. And that's why today Eric Garcetti's comment, you can see it, what kind of silly comment he made. At the same time, I would say
Yes.
that for the Russians, Russia needs China today to counter the West. And in my view, the world is emerging into a Cold War 2.0 kind of a scenario. And that will be basically this is USA that has pushed Russia into the Chinese bracket to that extent. But Russia, those of us who know Russia well, we know that Russia is not a country that likes to be subjugated under any circumstances by any power. It wants to be a pole by itself. And therefore, they are spreading their wings more within the SCO, the BRICS, the other alternate mechanisms. And in all that, they know that India is an extremely important partner for them. So it is not for India alone that we have this special and privileged strategic partnership with Russia, but from Russia's perspective also, India provides them that necessary pivot that they need to counter the Chinese hegemonistic influence in their own periphery, whether in their backyard or within Central Asia or elsewhere, or even in their Far East. So that's what the whole visit of Prime Minister Modi there and the outcomes are pretty much geared towards that.
Yeah. Mr. Aneja, how does China see this? We know that China's got its own expansionist policy, but when it counters the West, when it counters the United States, how does it move forward, considering that, it sees itself as the leader of the South Asian region?
Well, the Chinese, as Shreya, have responded by saying that this is an excuse for the expansion of NATO towards the East. So the Chinese are viewing it clearly as an excuse for NATO's expansion towards them. So they are the victims, and that the NATO is going to expand into Asia, with them as the target. So that's number one. Number two, I don't see the Chinese really being too worried about what the statements have come over there, because they have this sphere of influence, whether it is in the South China Sea. When you really see countries of the ASEAN, I mean, they're deeply invested economically, geoeconomically with China. China is a major investor in their country. So I think, despite all the rhetoric which goes on, the Chinese are not going to be too worried about where the West looks at them when they look in their backyard. I think neither is it going to impact their relationship with Russia, because you see, China and Russia share one very common thread, that they both feel that in the bigger picture, they are the ultimate victims of regime change. Now, let me explain that very quickly. You had from 2010 onwards regime changes taking place in the Arab world through the Arab Spring. Well, I was in that region at that time. And when you saw the Chinese and the Russian reaction, especially after 2011 the killing of Gaddafi, they said, look, now is the time that the regime change will start from Libya to Syria, from Syria to Iran, and ultimately we will be the victims of that. That was the understanding of the Chinese election. So they're strategically, they look in these terms. So which means that episodic events, tactical events are not going to unhinge their bonding with each other. So they're not going to be worried either about the relationship with Russia or the relationship in Southeast Asia. Regarding South Asia, well, right now you have the Bangladesh president Bangladesh Prime Minister visiting China. And so they have their nodes in South Asia, but right now I really don't think, though we have a border situation with the Chinese are not really looking that intensively into South Asia. Their focus is more now in the Ukraine side, expansion of NATO, South China Sea. I think those are the areas of concern to them, but they are not, breaking into a sweat over the situation. They still feel confident that they are a country on the rise and they can handle these multiple challenges which they are facing, and also in the process have the ability to further their own national interests in these geographies.
Okay. Okay, quickly then let me ask you my last question, Ambassador Trigunayat. How do you see NATO really moving forward, considering that in their communique, it details very thoroughly that NATO has a plan to launch 4 projects in collaboration with Asia-Pacific partners to back Ukraine. Clearly that aim is there, that goal is there. Do you think it's going to be successful in expanding itself in the Asian-Pacific region?
Well, I think they'll try their best. As we know, the last time when they tried to do it in Japan, there were the countries that were not very keen on it. But in the meantime, the United States had patched up between South Korea and Japan, and Australia is already part of that. And so there are certain concerns among the countries, but that's happening, and that will happen to some extent. And we have just learned that in Jordan, they are going to set up their coordinating office as well, which is also decided now. They have a very
Yeah.
big base there. So I think that the NATO will continue to expand. It's already 32 countries from 40 in 1991, and therefore they are looking at it. But the fact is that how we are going to see the war emerging henceforth, because if they are going to pump in more arms, ammunition inside, and Russia continues to be as defiant as now, then we are going to see an escalation, and that escalation could actually be very, very worrisome, and I think could lead to even the bigger wars. And so there is something that is happening, and I think that this is a
Okay.
very, very one has to be very careful, and nobody is listening. Actually, everybody is just fanning the clouds of war.
All right, we'll leave it there. Let's see how this really moves forward. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us on Nation Tonight. Pleasure talking to both of you, Atul Aneja and
Thank
Anil
you.
Trigunayat. Thank you very much for joining us tonight and sharing your perspectives.